Welcome back to the Dungeon Master's Block, the place where we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God, killing characters, and lowering the egos of all other people at the table. I'm one of your hosts, DM Mitch, and today we are going to be discussing magic and cultures. And for that topic, we are going to be joined by a new guest, author JC Kang. We're really excited for him to be able to be with us on this show. It's a great episode. We hope that you are going to enjoy it. Before we dive in, though, we of course have a 5-star review. And this 5-star review comes from Dude55689999 and is entitled One of the Bests. Very recent subscription, but glad I found it. Thanks so much for that awesome review, dude. We appreciate it. Glad that you found it. And as you just found us, you have a plethora of episodes to check out. We hope that you enjoy the ride all along the way. But with that, let's head into the meat.
I'm starving. We ain't had nothing but maggoty bread for 3 stinking days.
Why can't we have some meats?
The plate meat's back on the menu, boys!
Welcome to another segment of The Meat. I'm really excited to be able to introduce to you a new guest to the Dungeon Master's Block. JC Kang is here today. He is a fantasy and sci-fi author specifically of the Dragon Song Saga and multiple other books. JC, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
We're excited to have you. I'm really glad you were able to carve out some time and join us. For those who are, which I guess is everybody because we're in podcast form, JC has a fantastic author setup behind him of what I'm assuming is a mixture of your books and other books.
So what's happened here is that my wife allowed me to carve out a niche of the guest bedroom for things like this, for interviews. This is obviously a podcast, but sometimes we do like Zoom interviews. And so I basically set up a shelf with some of the most influential books for me. Like here I have Dragonlance from...
I was to say so much Dragonlance. Yes.
Yeah, Dragonlance. Here are a bunch of signed books from author friends of mine. This is mostly YA stuff. I do have my own stuff here. More of that. It's basically based upon the height of the shelf as to how things got placed. But a lot of different things. If I'm known for one thing, it might be for my amplification of Asian fantasy. So down here on the next shelf is a lot of Asian fantasies, a lot of authors who have put out works in the last few years. And, you know, I'm a reviewer for Fantasy Faction, and I interviewed several of them and did book reviews for their books. And so I get signed copies.
We are kindred spirits, certainly in that. Anyone that we can get a signed copies of in person, get it shipped, we're definitely on board. There's something about having that human touch to a book that just elevates it, in my opinion.
It's special, yeah.
Yeah. So another question to jump right into our interview section a little bit is there anything you can tell us about yourself? We made some jokes earlier before we started recording, long walks on the beach, or just really anything you think our listeners would be interested in.
Well, I'm 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, but I guess they probably are not too interested in that. By trade, I'm an acupuncturist and a Chinese herbal medicine doctor. I also teach Wing Chun Kung Fu, and those are kind of like the job and the paying hobby. And then
the jobby.
Yes, the jobby. And then, of course, writing on the side. We have a big vegetable garden. I have a rat terrier dog, and that's about my life. Oh, I have 2 kids too.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And then for those who, whether they have been able to keep up with your work or those who this is their first introduction to you, can you tell us a little bit about, are you working on any current projects or books right now that you'd like our listeners to know about?
So I guess the big success I had was with the Dragon Song Saga. And that was originally, I envisioned this entire world, well, not initially, but I imagined writing 3 quartets that interlaced with each other, and Dragon Song Saga is the complete one. I have also written book ones and published book ones of the other two. And as of today, I picked back up the sequel to one of the books. I've actually been in something of a rut for the last 4 or 5 months after I read Lee Bardugo's Six of Crows. And I was just so blown away by what an amazing book that was, and the found family and the witty banter and just the damaged characters. Like, oh, I have no business writing. But I'm back to it. I was like, they're going to ask me what I'm working on, so I'm going to work on something today. So I can thank you guys. I can thank you guys for getting me back in the saddle.
Yes. Oh, that's awesome. And I feel like we're just continuing to make those spirits even more kindred, because I feel the same. I'll listen to a podcast and be like, why do I get in front of a mic? But it's guests like you that help motivate us to keep going. And thankfully, we also have some amazing patrons. So if you're ready, I have a surprise question for you.
Go ahead.
So, if a massive modern city existed in your home game universe, what kinds of jobs would fall on urban environment druids?
Okay. Tough question, but my most recent book, Quantum Cultivation, written under the pen name JC Kang, is set in 2800 Kyoto, and there is very little green space there. And the jobs of keeping it clean falls on what we call the purebred. And these are people who are not genetically modified. They're sort of the benchmark for where Homo sapiens can sort of gauge where they've come from. It's kind of like Gattaca. I don't know, I might be showing my age as the movie there, but I imagine if there were druids in this world, they would be the ones taking care of the green spaces and making sure that the endangered species were less endangered.
I love it. So first, thank you for answering it. And it's always weird to think about like what municipal jobs like magic people with magic would end up having.
Bringing these fantastic like classes into like more of a mundane like area. I like that.
Well, and also DM Exitium was the one that sent us that question. So thank you to him as well. But what were you going to say, JC?
I was going to give a huge shout out to Zach Pike's Orconomics, which has a city with magic people and they have various jobs, and also JC Nelson, one of my critique partner, who writes urban fantasy, and there are magical creatures that have mundane jobs that you're like, oh wow, that's really creative. So highly recommend his Grim Agency.
So JC, when you and me were talking about a topic for this upcoming episode, what we landed on was we really love to bring on guests to talk about something that they're passionate about. And obviously you're passionate about your books, your stories that you've told, the world building that you've gone through and made. And so one of the aspects that we decided to talk about is magic and culture, and how, depending on the different cultures that we're talking to a lot of DMs right now, a lot of people who go through world building, sense of like how magic works. It can really dive into the weeds of different things that magic can be different depending on the culture. Now, this conversation because in your fantasy novels, you really dive in deep to this. And I was able to kind of do a little bit exploring on your website and just see videos that you even done talking about this. So for our listeners, can you give a little bit of background to your world that you've built, which you did say started as a D&D world, right? Like a world that you played in?
So you had mentioned a little background, and I'm going to give you a lot of background.
Give it to us.
Yes. Basically, the world that I write in started off as my Dungeons & Dragons campaign world, which I created when I was like 13 or 14 years old. Now, when you're 13 or 14 and you're a man, or a boy, I should say, you're thinking about one thing, rolling dice. And so later on, I created this world. I had certain concepts in it, but it was a very basic world because at age 14, you don't have a lot of life experience. You don't necessarily know how the world works. And so, I stopped playing Dungeons & Dragons probably when I was like 19 years old. I just didn't have time. And this is back in the day when it wasn't cool. Like nowadays, Critical Role, all this has made Dungeons & Dragons kind of cool, kind of popular. Back in the day, it was not, so 20 some years later, I'm at my mom's house. She wants me to clear out my old bedroom of some things, and I came across my Dungeons and Dragons world. And I'm here looking at it and just laughing at myself because I was like, oh my gosh, I mean, what is a 14-year-old? Well, I knew what a 14-year-old thought about. And so I said, I'm going to recreate this world. And so I went and took basically 6 days every day, just starting with the map and dealing with countries and cultures and put it all together. I was influenced heavily by the video game Civilization, the computer game Civilization, which has like real cultures, but oftentimes in proximity to each other. That places that were not in proximity to each other can be within the game. And so I created this world with this idea that certain cultures would be influenced by each other that wouldn't have been influenced each other in real history. And so the other aspect of this was that after, when I was done, I was here thinking, I'm really not going to play Dungeons and Dragons again. And in the grand scheme of things, when I was a dungeon master, my players didn't do what I wanted them to do. Anyway, they didn't follow the script. So I was like, I'm going to write stories. What I've learned as an author is that actually your characters don't follow your script either. As you write them, they take a life of their own, and you get to know them better. And the things you wanted them to do, you realize you can't. Sometimes you have to make them do it by external forces. They're not going to do it on their own. So, but in any case, what I have in the world of Tivara is 8 human ethnic groups that are based on real historical cultures. So for example, the one I write in the most is East Asian. It's kind of a fusion of Qing Dynasty China and Sengoku era Japan. And they use artistic magic, that is magic that is evoked through artistic endeavor. So the main character of the Dragon Songs is Kaya, and she has the perfect voice to evoke the lost magic of Dragon Songs, which is using music to evoke magic, and also dance as well, letting the music move you to evoke a magic effect. And so that's what her particular culture has. But right to the south of them is a South Asian culture, and they are a little bit more like Jedi Knights in terms of like maybe not original series, which I like the best, but more like prequel series, where you have people doing, Jedi doing really cool things, moving faster than humanly possible, deflecting, bolts. Well, I guess you don't have to deflect it from stormtroopers because they're going to miss anyway. And then, but nothing like the sequel series where the Force just goes out of control. So that's the South Asian side of the world. And then if you go farther south, you go into the East African side, and they're more like classical sorcery. In the grand scheme of things, a lot of this was based a lot on Dungeons and Dragons. So for example, I don't call them clerics, but there are people who do divine magic. I don't call them druids, but I call them shamans. And then of course the music is bards, and then magicians. So there are things that could relatively relate to like old school second edition Dungeons and Dragons. That was a very long answer.
Yeah.
I need to take a few breaths here.
No, but that's great. So when in your world that started as a D&D world and now has transitioned into these books, these novels, when you travel to different cultures and meet these different people, like you said, behind this curtain, there has been D&D inspiration of, you're saying, of like classes, like the bards, the sorcerers, and I love the idea of coming to, as DMs who are listening, coming to your world and thinking about the different aspects of the different cultures in your world and asking that question with magic and how magic works. And I think there's many ways to do it, and one of those is exactly what you're talking about, and like an entire culture that's focused on, I love that, the art and magic through art, and a bard-like culture is super, super interesting. And I mean, as you're walking through their cities, their towns, it's going to be very, very apparent that this is a different type of culture based all off of like picking a certain class in D&D and saying, well, what would an entire culture that is really focused on bard magic look like? What would their town square look like? What would their government look like? It really starts you with one question, starts to open up all different other questions that can really bring life to a world.
That's what I absolutely love about world building, is like one little element can just expand out into something new. I should clarify that the main place where the Dragon Songs takes place is a place I call Cathay, which is based upon East Asia. It's not just music. In fact, that's a dead art. But however, there are other ones like calligraphy and painting and textiles. And so all of these appear within the world building in terms of just decorations, like signs on buildings, one thing to try to welcome someone to come in. So all these little things do appear. There's more common magic, that I should say, in this world. And so, yeah, you'll see a little bit of that as well.
And now I'm just imagining like almost like Times Square like setting in a fantasy world with these bright paintings and such, but instead of like neon lights, it's paintings that are creating magical lights in a fantasy world, and I love that.
But if you go into magical lights, when I speak of the East African culture to the south, one of the most basic spells they do is wizard lights. And so all the apprentices, that's one of the things they practice on. So what they end up with is a huge surplus of magical lights that are infused into little glass beads. And so they export that. And so most of the cities in this world are lit by continual light baubles. So
the other thing that I mean, maybe I hadn't invested much thought into, but I will, of course, invest way too much thought into now that you have given me it, is the idea of, like, based on the culture, the speed at which magic happens is such an interesting idea of, like, the calligraphy and writing something down quickly to enact that spell, opposed to the idea of building something, like building a magical structure, and like decades could go into the magic of that structure and that final brick be laid, and then it happens.
Well, there are aspects of this. I mean, one of the main concepts of this world is there is deep magic and shallow magic. And shallow magic comes from within a person, versus the deep magic is drawn from the energy of the world. And each culture describes this energy of the world in different ways. The people who see the future, basically, these are the equivalent of Romans. What diviners, they call it the whispers of the gods. And then, for example, the South Asians, the Jedi, they call it the vibrations of the world. And so everyone has like a different name for that source of magic. And when I started writing Quantum Cultivation, which is my cyberpunk mashup that takes place in future Earth, I wanted to find a way to connect that to my Tivara world. And so that sort of well, anyway, they do connect in terms of, even though there are different magic, there are different names for it, it's basically based on the same magic system.
So a question I have for you, while you were building this world of Tivara, and you said you really drew inspiration from real world history and real world cultures. Somewhere along that world building, you decided, I'm going to create this culture in my world that has historical tie-ins to a culture in the real world. And then somewhere along that world building, you decided, and this culture in my world will have magic that is brought about by art. And this culture will have magic that's kind of along the lines of a cleric, like you're pulling upon a divine source. How did you kind of decide which culture would have the different magical focuses? Was that drawn from real world cultures and kind of ideas from that, or was that kind of just chosen with what you wanted?
To some degree, and a lot of it was chosen based upon what I needed at a given situation, and I had to make sure it made sense within the bigger world building picture. The basic idea of this is that the ability to manipulate magic or to use magic is carried on an X chromosome. So a female is much more likely to have magic than a male, just like male pattern baldness. But so what happened, part of the backstory of the world, is that at one time the orcs of the world controlled everything and humans were just slaves to them. And at this time, the orcs had won a huge worldwide battle against the elves of the world. And so then the elves were now in hiding. And then at a certain point, there's a certain conjunction of the moons, and that's part of what can influence magic as well, is certain positions of the planets and the moons. When the gods sent their angels, the elf gods sent their angels down to the world to basically destroy the orcs, but they had to do it by using a long-term magic. They were doing this magic spell that would take several years to enact. But in the meantime, they were searching the world trying to find the pockets of elves who were in hiding. And they came across humans, and they realized, okay, if we use this magic, it's going to wipe out the humans as well. And so elves don't trust humans in most worlds. And so they said, well, we can use these humans to help us, but we're not going to teach them everything we know. And so they were the ones who decided, okay, we're going to teach the East Asians artistic magic. We're going to teach the Eastern Europeans empathic magic. We're going to teach the indigenous Native Americans shamanic magic. So yeah, so there it is. You can see it's probably somewhat tied into to real historical things, but there was basically that's the backstory with the elves deciding ultimately who learns what. The elf angels, I should say.
Oh, I'm trying to think of the piece that sounded so much like a dungeon master. Like you can see the essence of like how dungeon mastering can help you develop stories. It was the part where you said some of it is influenced by what you needed at the time. And yeah, like it's such an important piece for dungeon masters to hold on to, is that like waiting to find what's necessary to let that influence your world, because it's world building isn't necessarily just like these Legos that you smash together. It's like it's almost artistic, because you have to let that come to you and then almost like flow through it as it happens.
And you have
because if
and you have to make sure it doesn't break what you've established already. Mm-hmm. That's the big thing. I mean, I harp on Star Wars a lot because I love it so much. But I mean, in like the sequel series, it's like you've broken the Force, you've broken hyperspace, all these things that were established like early on, you've broken them. And so I kind of see that in world building, is that you have to make sure that if you introduce like a concept, that it's something that couldn't have resolved the problem in before. Why didn't this person use this before? Or why didn't this culture use it before? Like going back to the sequel series, why weren't they hyperspacing like smaller vessels into like Star Destroyers? You know, why is that? I mean, so going back to Star Wars, here I am criticizing J.J. Abrams, and
I mean, I love J.J. Abrams.
I don't.
But I'm on board. I totally agree.
I don't. He's like, I'll give you a lens flare and a cool special effect, but screw the story. Yeah. Screw precedent. You know.
I mean, if we're being honest, why didn't you just do it earlier in that movie? Nonetheless, the whole series.
Right. I mean, yeah. Anyway.
But you hit on a piece that's very important, especially once I think you start talking about magic and cultures, is that whatever rules you set are the rules you need to continue to follow, or else it doesn't start to make sense for your players, and it doesn't make sense for you. It's the same with time travel. I don't care how you do time travel, whatever rules you set, just follow them. That's all I'm asking of you.
If something breaks those rules, the players who hopefully have learned the established rules, when they react and go, wait, what? Like, that's not how this works. As you as a DM, if you as a world builder are just like, yeah, but I just want it to work in this specific situation. No, it could be a cool catalyst to a story. Like, oh, yes, you're correct. It doesn't work that way. This is strange. Maybe you should look into this. But a simple, like, I don't know, D&D, we talk about the rule of cool a lot. Certainly when I'm playing with my players, I do want to lean into that rule of cool, but there is an established way a world I think should work. If you do want to create a world that feels real, there does need to be a set of rules that the world works by. And if those rules change, if those rules all of a sudden are broken, there needs to be some attention on that as, yeah, this is weird. This is different.
So going back to hyperspace, and once again, in Star Wars, we're told that it's not like dusting crops. It's something that's difficult. And yet in The Force Awakens, the Millennium Falcon jumps out of hyperspace into a planet's atmosphere. And then in The Last Jedi, they ram whatever that the ship is, the Raddus, into the Super Star Destroyer, the Super Duper Quadruper Star Destroyer. And then in The Rise of Skywalker, Poe is his X-wing is jumping from planet atmosphere to planet atmosphere to planet atmosphere, and all they could have said, I mean, if they had just established, hey, advances have been made in hyperspace, but they didn't. They just did it. You know, it's just like there could have been so many ways they set that up that could have made that work. But I think once again, you know, J.J. Abrams, he likes the visual effects, and he doesn't really think about precedent. I mean, I'm still kind of disappointed with some of the things that happen in Star Trek too.
So kind of building off of this idea that we're talking about with coming to different cultures in a world and asking the question, how does magic work differently? How is it approached differently? How is it handled differently? For our listeners out there who are creating these homebrew worlds, if they're like listening to this and they're like, this is a really cool idea, I would like to start thinking about this, start thinking about how my cultures handle magic differently, use magic differently. As somebody who has literally gone through this process of creating a world where magic is approached differently, do you have any advice or maybe even like, you've probably thought about this so much. Are there different ideas that you had along the way that you kind of said, no, not for my world, but you're like, this would be a cool way to build a world around magic? Any advice or ideas for our listeners?
So I would say this is a chicken and the egg thing in terms of if you have certain aspects of magic, it will influence the culture. If a culture is a certain way, it'll influence the way magic is interpreted. At the core, my stories are basically based on the idea that everything has a vibration or a resonance to it, and how you influence. And this is played out in the real world as well. I mean, if you take like if you take iron versus say copper, they resonate at a different frequency, and it's all based upon molecular structure. And so that's how sort of the basic mechanics of my world work, is that everything is based on resonance. And so once again, how a culture describes that, how a specific cultural group describes that, is based upon their cultural understanding. And once again, that magic, if it's been a large influence in their development, it has influenced how their culture has developed as well.
The resonance is such an interesting concept also of like continuing that out. Like my world building brain says, are there two cultures that like oppose each other with that resonance, and like their magic basically can cancel each other out, like was my first thought. And then so many other thoughts of, like you said, the culture, like what is your chicken, what is your egg, of like, you know what, I have this idea that, going back to the druids, I really need someone to do this in my world when it comes to magic. And then you're like, oh, that would work great with this culture, or I build a culture around that. Or I have this culture that already is very eco-friendly, if we will. And so then like, oh, should I give them druidic magic because they're starting to hone in on that resonance, that frequency, and whatever aspect it is that builds magic in your world?
Well, part of that is gauged by conflict. And so I think that oftentimes what we see in our own world is that a lot of conflict happens within a culture itself. And so, for example, the place that they practice, martial magic, Jedi Knights, the Jedi had the Sith, right? And so they're within, the South Asian aspect of my world, the South Asian region of my world, you do have people who use martial magic for good, so to speak, and then you have some who use it for evil, so to speak. And so they have particular skills that are meant to be used against each other, just because that conflict brings out innovation. So that's one aspect. And then you go to the sorcery group down in the East African part of my world, you have 12 different schools of magic, and some just sort of are opposites of each other. So one works better against another. What I like when I created the quantum cultivation world, which the magic system was based on the Chinese medicine concept of 5 elements, you have very clearly water being able to defeat fire, and fire being able to temper metal, and metal being able to cut wood, and the roots of wood being able to hold earth into place. So you have a very clear cycle of what element can defeat another, and that will eventually find its way back into Tivara, just because there is a slight overlap there as well.
Yeah, I love the idea of it. Like we said earlier, once you start asking the one question, it opens up all these other questions that, as you're world building, you can like get excited about and go, yeah. So what does that mean? So when you've established these nations, these cultures, these groups of people that go about magic differently, then you have to start asking, well, how do they interact? And it could be war. It could just be like it could be peace. It could be misunderstandings.
Trade.
How does a culture, a nation that is built up around wizards that, I mean, first of all, I imagine their cities having tremendous libraries and having such a love and respect for books and lore and the study of spells. And then you come and you say, well, how does that group of people interact with the nation that is all sorcerers, and they're getting their magic just from their bloodline that comes from dragons or whatever it is, and they don't have to study at all. I can imagine there being some tension between those groups. The wizards thinking that they were the sorcerers, the people in that nation just literally don't really truly respect their power because they've never had to put any work into it. And you can certainly imagine the sorcerer nation looking down on the wizarding nation being like, yeah, clearly we were chosen with purpose here, and they have to toil through books endlessly to harness the power that we were just innately given.
That's a really great insight. I'm writing this down for my next book.
Hey.
So no, I was saying I'm working on a sequel. Well, the book to that is Masters of Deception. I'm putting it up here on the screen, so those of us on Zoom can see it. But one of the main characters of this story, her arc is she belongs to this clan of, I say, biomancers, or people who basically manipulate life energy. And however, there was a conflict within their conclave, and their clan was stripped. All their spell books were destroyed. And they were disgraced. And so this one biomancer, by virtue of also having pyromancer blood as well, was able to learn a little higher grade magic. And so most of her thing is learning how to study other families of magic, and seeing how it relates to the lost biomancy spells, so that she can start to put them together herself, just from observing other types of magic. And that's actually, and now I think about it, that's in dragon songs as well. You have this young woman who is a dragon singer, or wants to be a dragon singer, but there's no teacher, so she has to observe, like, how do the Jedi-like people, how do they use magic, and she observes that. Or how do sorcerers use magic, and she observes that, and all of that helps her develop on her own.
Yeah, and even kind of now you've sparked even more, because you talked about cultures that are based on very like cleric-like magic, that they're drawing their magic upon from a divine source. And when I think of a world of D&D, and I think of clerics, and I think of paladins, and the way that they get their magic, there are typically some stipulations to that. Like, you need to be in line with your god to some degree. You need, like, if you totally turn away from the way that your god wants you to live your life, and then you broaden that to a nationwide or a people-wide group, the power may be taken away from you. And again, what if you have a whole entire nation that is built around something like that, where magic, listen, like, magic has rules, but not only rules to magic, but rules to how you live your life and how you use that magic. And then you come across a wild magic type group that is totally not just like not worried about rules, but embracing the chaos. Those two groups of people are going to have some sort of clash if they meet up together, whether that's individuals in a group, if you have players in your game that are from those different places, or if they're nations that are coming into some sort of conflict together.
Indeed. Yeah. I was going to say book 3, if I ever get to it, for that series, does deal with that. That will be mostly about sort of the cleric, the divine magic, and how a sultan of a country deviated from the path, and how his clerics, his acolytes, all lost their power because of it. And then part of this is also the influence of a foreign magic as well that does that. So
it also got me thinking of the idea behind having a culture whose magic is related to collective belief, is probably the best term I can use. And that, I mean, sounds really, really nice, because it also makes me think of orcs in Warhammer 40,000 who just genuinely believe that red things go faster. And because they all believe it, you get a +1 on your vehicle movements, because red things go faster.
is that only if you're an orc?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, because you believe. And so then
It's like Santa Claus.
adding that idea in, that collective belief could also be where magic comes from, based on the culture, and that, like, as long as everyone is on board, then, like, that's how it works. It was a really interesting concept, because you could also enter a world or enter that culture, and then something that worked one way everywhere else works differently here, because there is that collective belief that that is how it works, and in turn that is true.
One of the as DMs, like coming to building a world for a D&D setting, one of the obvious ones, JC, you talked about kind of basing these cultures, these groups of people, and the way they use magic on class types. Obviously, you could also go the other route of basing it off of schools of magic. And at least from what I was reading on your website, it does seem like there is that element that is present in your world as well. It's not a magic school, but I know that there's a group of people in your world that have runes as magic, like that's their focus. But certainly when you lay out all the schools of magic for D&D and start to ask, okay, what if an entire culture is built around evocation? What does that look like? Necromancy, what does that look like? It really can start to paint a picture in your head of how a culture would go about not just harnessing magic, but it can start to paint a picture of how their architecture looks, what is important in their society, what taboos they may have in their society. And again, then you start to ask, what about the two cultures coming together, divine magic culture and a necromancy culture coming together? There's going to be some really difficult, sometimes interesting interactions, which now makes me want to be an ambassador as a player in one of these worlds, because I would love to be like, all right, we're either coming from the necromancy culture, and how do we have to like learn how to interact with these other cultures, or going to the necromancy culture, and what are the things that we need to kind of like understand this is part of this people and how they operate. And it might really seem odd or even downright dark and evil to me. What am I going to have to do as an ambassador?
I am going to highly recommend Phil Tucker's Empire of the Dead if you want to see what a necromantic culture looks like. It's basically a Babylonian setting, and basically being one person can raise the dead, and the dead are all the servants and stuff like that. So it's interesting, his interesting take on that. Highly recommend it. Oh, it's also a heist. So it's like kind of Ocean's 11 meets Gilgamesh and the Fear of the Walking Dead.
I also I feel you're hurting my brain and my ever-growing list of books. Yes. I'm just like, oh crap, I got to read all of these now. I definitely need to. I think Mitch hit on it a little bit, but is there, and I'll ask it in a different way, is there some aspect that just didn't work while you were developing it and like kind of went to the cutting room floor? Because I know I do that as a DM a lot. Like I'll build the world and be like, that sounds so good, but it just won't fit. When you were developing magics and cultures, was there some sort of pain point, I guess?
There's so much that happens in this world. If there was, I have since forgotten it. I tend to be a recycler. So if there's an idea I really like, but it doesn't fit, I'll try to find a way to integrate it into an unrelated short story. But I'm kind of the opinion that I can almost make anything fit into this world, almost. So
love it. Nope. And that's a great mentality, because I was thinking the same thing of just like, if I don't use it, then it just sits over here until I can use it. Because I can use it at some point. Like there's no idea is a bad idea, because at the very least, every idea got you to a better one. So
well, I think being able to hyperspace a StarCraft into another, that's a bad idea. but I would say that, yeah, now that I think about it, since you sparked my imagination here, it was the Chinese medicine martial arts system that I created for quantum cultivation, or rather I hadn't created specifically for quantum cultivation. I had created this magic system, but I didn't think it fit within the magic system of Tivara. And so that's why I put it into a different story. But then as I was writing quantum cultivation, I was able to see, okay, actually I can tie this back in to the magic of Tivara as well. Originally, I didn't think it would have fit. And actually that's what gave me the motivation to finish quantum cultivation, because that was kind of a real tooth puller for a while. I was just like, this book just won't end. I can't figure it out. But once I figured out how to tie those things together, it was much more smooth sailing.
Oh, which is such a good point, because I know myself and a lot of DMs, like some just play Dungeons and Dragons, some play Dungeons and Dragons and Shadowrun and masks and all these things. So yeah, like not limiting yourself to like just because an idea didn't work in one almost genre of RPG, but having it ready to adapt and play into a different one is a great piece of advice.
My brain is just spinning with all different ways that this can manifest in a world that's being created. I'm thinking about a druidic civilization and how that would look in a world. I'm wondering if it would be like, oh, they would all gather in this one great forest and keep on like cultivating this forest, or are they completely spread out through the world? And so when you're traveling in this world, whenever you go into a forest, you're going to come across like little groups of these druidic people, and they've completely said no to civilization, and they just get out into the wilderness. Of course, the necromancy thing is still kind of going off in my mind. I'm thinking about cultures that focus on elemental magic and whether they have a tie-in in your world to the planes of different elements, like the plane of fire, the plane of air. Maybe they can travel between them like at will. It really just starts to, just from like picking a certain type of magic or a certain type of class, create a whole different setting, a whole different group that is based off of that. And to me, I think that's a really cool concept, because I know I've struggled with, if I don't think about a culture or a city enough that players are visiting, it turns into kind of like the same thing. I remember playing the first Assassin's Creed game, and it turned me off to the entire series, because it was like you would go to the different cities, and I remember being like, these are all the same.
Mhm.
It just feels like cutouts of the city I just like went to. And so I feel like if you're in the first stages of building your world and you want some inspiration, and you have your players, they do that classic player thing of saying, you know what, you want us to go north, we're going to go south, and you have to like come up with something, come up with a place or a people for them to visit, a group for them to run into. Like, this is a great way to start that idea in your head and just say, okay, let me pick a magic school. Let me pick a class that uses spells, and let me base this city, this place they're going to, this nation, around this type of magic.
I think one series that does that brilliantly, of course, is Avatar: The Last Airbender. You know, the Fire Nation has a certain type of architecture. Their people have a certain type of attitude. Same thing, the Earth Nation, they have a certain kind of architecture. They have a certain type of personality. The Air Nomads, that's actually not the Air Nomads. Sorry about that. The Water Nation, that's actually the cool thing. The Water Tribe is that you have the Northern and Southern Tribe, and they have two very different cultures, even though they have the same magic. So I think that's kind of cool how that developed.
That's perfect. And I think that leads us into one of my favorite questions to ask. And you've certainly done a great job of peppering it throughout, but we always call this next section the homework section of different movies, books, podcasts, etc., that we can throw out to our listeners to engage with a lot of the topics we've been talking about. So if I was going to like quickly go through some of the ones you've already said, we've got Six of Crows, is definitely check that out. Orconomics, and then The Empire of the Dead are three books you've already thrown out, including checking out The Last Airbender. So are there other kind of pieces of media that you think would be good inspiration for our listeners?
Oh gosh, I have a whole long list. Let me go look at my bookshelf.
It's okay, I'm already sitting down.
Waters of Salt and Sin by Alicia Klevecki. Number one is just the prose is beautiful, and she's not the one she doesn't use SAT words. She uses everyday words, but somehow creates these really evocative sentences. But it's a really cool world building in terms of how the magic has worked, and also just everything. Actually, as Mitch was saying, how does the magic and the culture interact, and how do they develop each other? Really good there. Vine Witch by Luan G. Smith. Also, she is just a brilliant wordsmith. I mean, she does use SAT words, but also just glorious writing, decadent writing. But I'm not one for wine. I'm more of a beer person when I actually drink at all. I don't, because I get fat easily. But I'm not into wine, I'm not into witches, but she does this really great job of creating actually different types of magic systems. She has like a genie magic system, she has fey magic, she has witch magic, and somehow puts them all together and has their cultures developed as well. So Luan G. Smith, Vine Witch, Charlie M. Holmberg's Spellbreaker. Actually, I haven't read that one yet, but she has a paper magician, plastic magician. This is a Victorian setting, and it's a magic system, magic school. And after you finish magic school, you go into a different material, and each material is manipulated different ways. Just a very, very fun book. Let's see what else I have here. Pulling this up so you can see it. Alec Hudson's Crimson Queen. Also very brilliant writing. Alec is a master wordsmith. And what I love about that is, in terms of the world building, is that it's once again very cultural. There's a kind of an East versus Middle East thing going on here. And the East and the Middle East have different type of magics, but they are somewhat related. And so you both get an amazing story, amazing world building, and an amazing magic system all in one. I don't have his book here, but Phil Tucker's, I mentioned his Empire of the Dead, but actually his Chronicle of the Black Gate is really fascinating. It has this idea of negative and positive energy and people using it in different ways, and also brings in demons as well. So highly recommend that. What else? That's enough for now, right?
That's
Yes.
That's a great starting point. Yeah, and you guys stole my homework, which was Avatar. I thought Avatar immediately. I was like, oh, that's a good one, and it goes into this culture as well. But yeah, obviously, JC, you just gave all of our listeners and us a great long list. And this is the best part. It sounds like you have more. That if we finish through those books, you have many more recommendations. So if our listeners would like to get in touch with you, maybe for some more recommendations, or just be able to follow you, see what you're currently working on, check out your body of work, where are the best places for them to be able to go and do those things?
So Facebook is a good place. I am at Legends of Tivara on Facebook. I am JC Kang 804, or maybe I'm John Kang. I'm JC Kang 804 on Twitter. And then lately I've been doing a lot of book reviews on both TikTok and Instagram. And so Instagram is jc.kang, I think, and TikTok is just JC Kang. So yeah, I'm all over the place on social media.
Fantastic. Well, JC, thanks again for joining us on an episode of the Dungeon Masters Block. I think this was a really interesting topic to dive into. It has my brain swirling with new ideas and new questions to ask when I come to the table and DM, or when I'm thinking about an upcoming story that I want to tell with my players in the world I want to build. So we appreciate your time, and hope to have you back on again in the future.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Well, thanks again to JC for joining us on this episode. I really hope that you enjoyed the discussion about how magic can bring new life to the cultures in your world. If you liked this episode of the Dungeon Masters Block, or you have liked previous episodes or maybe future episodes, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on whatever podcatcher app you use to listen to our show. It helps to broaden our audience, to reach old DMs, new DMs, and aspiring DMs alike. You can follow us on Twitter at DMS_block. That's at DMsBlock, and you can like our Facebook page for updates about the show. And as always, the Dungeon Masters Block is a proud member of the Block Party Podcast Network. Check out other shows like Detentions and Dragons, Dungeons and Dragons and Daughters, Geek Wars, and more. Well, that's all we have for you on this episode of the Dungeon Masters Block, the place that we come to talk about the Dungeon Master, the most important person in the game, the only person capable of playing God, killing characters, and lowering the egos of all their people at the table. I'm DM Mitch, reminding you to always keep on dungeon mastering.